All right, welcome to Chapter 4, Section 1, The War for Independence. I know a lot of you aren't familiar with the music in the background, but it's Revolution by the Beatles. And the reason I have it playing is because when we're talking about a revolution can mean a lot of different things. And I think this is one time that we can actually use some popular music to kind of bring home the idea of how big and important true revolutions are. They're not simply rebellions, or they're not wars in the typical sense. It's a total change in the dynamic of a country, a nation, or an attitude or culture. All right, let's talk about the War for Independence. The United States was not yet a country. They were colonies of Great Britain on the Atlantic seaboard. And one of the unique things about it was that the standard of living in what is today the United States was actually better than it was back in the home country. And gentlemen like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, George Washington had been reading the Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes. And I can't believe I listed Hobbes as an Enlightenment philosopher, but he was in his own accord. But anyway, nonetheless, and these ideas combined with the economic factors that we're going to be facing will determine whether or not the American colonies will stay part of Great Britain or not. One of the major misconceptions when we study the American Revolution is the fact that people say the British were this incredibly large, evil empire that forcing poor Americans to pay a tremendous tax burden. That really wasn't the case. Remember, winners write history. And in the case of the American Revolution, the winners were, of course, the Americans, though a lot of French aid and Spanish aid and even Russian aid helped a lot on that. The British had come up with measure after measure to pay for the French and Indian War. One of these measures was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required stamped paper for documents and printed items. Now, a stamp, and I'll show you an example of one in just a minute, a stamp was either something similar to a notary public today, but it could also be a stamp, like we'd put on a letter. We don't think anything of having to put a stamp on a letter. We don't see it as incredible taxation, but the colonists did. And one reason, and we'll talk about it later, is the fact that the colonists did not get to vote in Parliament. And they saw this whole idea as taxation without representation. And they viewed that as being unfair. As soon as the Stamp Act was passed, as one of many measures that were put into place, the Americans began to protest it. Protest is an American tradition that we're all familiar with. And even today, you see protests going on football fields, in streets. And sometimes, unfortunately, protests take on the mantra of a riot or even civil disturbance. Hopefully, most protests don't turn into that. But the same thing happened in the 18th century when the Americans were beginning to protest the Stamp Act and other British taxes. Started as peaceful protests, economic boycotts, but many times turned into riots. A gentleman named Samuel Adams helped found a group called the Sons of Liberty, and it was a secret resistance group. Most of them were members of the Masonic Lodge, but not all of them. Sometimes people want to use that to say, well, it was a Masonic group. The Sons of Liberty were not a Masonic group like the Shriners or another Masonic group, but many of the members were Masons. Their main goal was to harass customs workers, stamp agents, and royal governors. A group of colonists actually got together and formed something called the Stamp Act Congress, a group of colonies. And they said, we can't be taxed without representation. Colonial merchants began to boycott British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. But believe it or not, Parliament gave in and repealed the Stamp Act on 1766. However, they also passed the Declaratory Act on the same day. And what the Declaratory Act said was, we are not going to give up our right to tax you. We can tax the colonies, basically to pay for their own defense and their own welfare. Here is an image of a stamp. You can see both types of stamps. Basically what would go on a letter or a document, a marriage certificate, a property deed, a letter. And as you can see, before you panic, that is actually a scarecrow-like thing up on the pole. It's not a real person. That's called an effigy. When someone makes a dummy of you and either hangs it or burns it or beats it, that's called effigy, or that's called an effigy. So they are actually impaling this stamp master in effigy. Again, here's another one. You see them hanging people in effigy. To our knowledge, there were no stamp collectors actually murdered. But, imagine if you were a stamp collector, how you would feel about this. You'd probably be terrified. This is an example of one of these protests turning a little bit more into a riot. And the British are becoming concerned about this. 1767, the Parliament begins to act on its promise that they could tax the colonies. And they begin to levy taxes or duties on imported materials such as tea, sugar, other things. This really upset the colonists. And again, Samuel Adams organized a boycott. The women stopped buying British luxuries, started joining spinning bees, and they began to boycott tea. This is when sassafras tea and some other types of American herbs were used to make tea as well. The customs agent seized John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, for unpaid taxes. Now here's where things begin to take a turn. John Hancock was a very rich colonial merchant who made most of his wealth more than likely from black market trade, basically smuggling goods past taxes and duties. And for years, the British had ignored this in what we learned to call salutary neglect last chapter. When Hancock's ship was seized, he got in touch with Samuel Adams and some others, and they began to riot. And 2,000 British soldiers had to come into Boston to stop the rioting. The soldiers competed with the colonists for shipyard jobs because soldiers actually weren't soldiers 24/7. They had day jobs, basically is the best way to put it. And a lot of these normal civilian people were put out of work. So they began to riot. Some British soldiers were outside. I think it was a tavern. Don't hold me to that. But anyway, the mob began to throw stones, and the British opened fire. And they killed 5. Now, bear in mind, we're not talking about throwing pebbles. They were throwing pieces of cobblestone, which could kill somebody. But nonetheless, the British soldiers were put on trial, but they were acquitted. And one of the ironies of the situation is the person who defended them was a fairly distant relative of Samuel Adams, John Adams, who would later become one of the leaders of the American Revolutionary Movement. At this time, he's defending the British soldiers. Basically, he's just doing their job. Again, history is a series of things that are similar. A lot of people say history repeats itself. There's validity to that argument. It appears that maybe the police, in this case, it were the British soldiers, the colonists felt like the police were being brutal. Much like today, sometimes people feel, one group or another, might feel that the police are actually discriminating or treating them differently. In 1773, all of the taxes were repealed except the tax on tea. But the tax tea was actually cheaper than the smuggled tea. So these same people, led by Hancock and others, and with the military, quote unquote, military leadership of Samuel Adams, they these disguised colonists, they disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and climbed on board and dumped 18,000 pounds of tea in the harbor. And this is known as the Boston Tea Party. This is an illustration of the Boston Massacre. And it does appear that it looks like these mean old British people are opening fire on those poor innocent colonists. In reality, the colonists again were throwing large rocks. We learned in the video The Story of Us how actually one of the British soldiers had been clubbed already. The first person killed was an African American by the name of Crispus Attucks, who is a free dock worker. This is a very romanticized drawing of the Boston Tea Party. Most of this occurred at night, so that you wouldn't have been able to see in this much detail. It looked a lot more organized than it was as well. Once all of this tea was dumped and all this property damage, this really upset the king, King George III. Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts to punish Boston. It closed Boston Harbor and put soldiers in empty homes and buildings all over Boston. Boston was basically under martial law, which is ruled by the military. The First Continental Congress was called and claimed colonial rights had been violated and supported the protest. Leaders such as Samuel Adams and Hancock and others had fled to Lexington and then Concord, and the British were sent to capture these leaders and to destroy the weapons that had been stored there. Paul Revere and John Dawes and Samuel Prescott took off to warn the people that the regulars are coming. Later, in the poem, it said the British. They wouldn't have used that term because they considered themselves British as well. The regulars was a term for the regular army, the British Army. The Minutemen, or the militia, had begun to stockpile firearms in pretty much every small town in Massachusetts. And when the British found out that there were a lot in Lexington, they headed that way to get the weapons and to try to capture Adams and Hancock. When the British arrived in Lexington, the local militia had assembled on the town commons, and the two sides square off. We still to this day do not know who fired the first shot. However, 3,000 to 4,000 Minutemen hear about these Americans being killed. Most of the fatalities at Lexington were American. And they began to gather along the road in the woods and behind stoneworks and all this. And as the British marched to Concord, dozens were killed. Here's another romanticized, pretty good picture of Lexington Commons. You notice how they all look like they just come from church? I doubt very seriously the Minutemen would have been that immaculately dressed. We'll pick up where we left off with the next video in section 2. Until then, hope you have a great day.